How you doing, guys? Today we are going to take a look at a couple seniors. Specifically, I'm going to be measuring the steering shafts of these two seniors because if you saw my last video, I temporarily tacked together my new steering shaft, but when I put it on the tractor, it just didn't look right. Unfortunately, I think it might be a little bit too long. So before I go making the outer tube and the upper bearing mount and stuff like that, I want to make sure that I have the length of the steering shaft correct. So we're heading over to my brother's house to take a look at his senior, take a measurement, and then a friend of mine has a senior that's fairly close to my brother. Just gonna run over to his house and take a look at his senior and take a measurement there also. So hopefully they'll both be the same for the two tractors, and will be equal to what I made mine. So with that, let's get over there. I'll try to take some videos of their two seniors. They're both really cool. I might be able to, I might not be able to, but in the short run, we're definitely going to be getting some measurements. So let's get to it. We are back. Now, everything worked out really, really good. Now, this is going to get a little convoluted on how I'm going to explain this, but just stick with me. All right. So both of the steering shafts from the top of the cap to the bottom of the steering wheel were 23 3/4 inches. Both of the seniors. Dead on. Okay? Now, in my case, I do have this little 1/4 inch spacer that I need, as you know, to preload the bearings. So, and this cap is approximately 1/4 inch thick. Okay? It might be a little bit more. So I'm measuring from the bottom, which would be the bottom of my cap, which would be theoretically the top, okay, the top of a normal senior cap, okay? We should end up at 23 3/4 to the bottom of the steering wheel. What are we? We're 23 5/8. So we're like 1/8 of an inch too short. Beautiful. Well, I'm not making any adjustments to this. So I'm going to leave this all be. The next thing I need to do is I need to go to my buddy's place real quick, and we're going to talk over how we're going to do the top bearing section, because my tractor is missing all the original top bearing section of the steering shaft. So I'm going to have to basically design and make that whole apparatus. So I'm just going to run over to my buddy's place real quick. I want to talk over a couple things with him. We'll be back. We'll discuss how we're going to fix this, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so to make the top support of the steering shaft, I'm going to kind of cobble a bunch of parts together in order to get it done. I don't have any of the original parts that the senior would have had. But there's a couple little aspects that I need in order for it to all function as it would on a senior. My original steering shaft, which was missing all these parts, as I said, had this big bronze bushing, I guess you'd want to call it. It's a piece of bar stock. It's actually quite heavy. It was pressed into the top of my steering tube, somewhere like this, like right around here. And it was supporting the top of the steering shaft. The only thing is this is a little bit bigger than 3/4, so the shaft kind of slopped around a little bit in this bushing, and I didn't want that to happen. Also, the way this kind of works is this spring, okay, goes into the steering tube and is like this position. And what that spring does is it causes an outward push of the cap. So the cap actually rides on the back side of the steering wheel. So as you turn the steering wheel, this cap also rotates because it's not pushed up against the tube. So that means this spring has to spin like this because this bushing is creating the pressure against the cap to keep it up against the steering wheel. But when you turn the wheel, this has to spin. So this is what I came up with. I'm going to reuse this because I can press this back into the tube and it'll stay put. But I'm going to bore it out 1 inch. So that way I can put this 3/4 by inner diameter by 1 inch outer diameter Torrington bearing into this bushing. That will in turn fit the shaft perfectly, get rid of all the slop, and also give me a nice smooth turning. Okay? For the spring, I'm going to take one of these 3/4, I think this is like 1 1/8, if I'm correct, outer diameter thrust washer. I'm going to put this thrust bearing on, okay? And I actually have another thrust washer, so it'll actually look like this, you know, one thrust washer on one side of the bearing, one thrust washer on the other side of the bearing, and then my spring, through pressure, will now be able to spin smoothly on top of the bushing. I also got a seal, and I'm going to put the seal on the bottom side of the bushing. This is also 3/4 inner, 1 inch outer. And I'll press this into the backside. So when I press this in, all right, the seal will be at the bottom, the bearing, the thrust washers in the bearing, and then the spring. And then I could fill this with grease, and theoretically the grease won't wick down or come out the bottom side of this bushing. It'll keep the bearings lubricated, and it'll keep this this Torrington bearing lubricated. I may drill it for a grease fitting, so that way I could just squirt grease into the top section of the steering column, but that is to be determined. That would be non-original, right? People would see that there's a grease fitting there, and that wouldn't be original to the tractor, but that's at a later date. That's not critical for what we're doing now. So let's run over to the machine shop. Let's bore this out just a hair smaller than 1 inch. Hopefully we can install the Torrington bearing. Hopefully we can install the oil seal. And then we can start figuring out where do we want to cut the tube. We are actually almost there. This Torrington bearing, I mean, it's just starting to fit. I mean, I could press that in, but I'm going to take a couple more thousandths off it just to make sure that it slides in nice and easy. And then the seal, this place is a disaster, as you can tell. The seal is right here, and that's almost ready to go in. So I'm just going to kiss it one more time with the boring bar, and then we're going to see how this all goes together. We are back. So everything's all machined out real nice. I'm going to go ahead and set it up here on the press. Shouldn't take much. Just going to go ahead and lube up the sides of the bearing. I think I'll lube them up with a little bit of blue Loctite, to be honest with you. I'm going to press it from this side in. This side is a little bit more tarnished. I'm going to put that on the top. I also beveled this edge a little bit to help me get that bearing in. But I'm going to get it in. I'm going to go in just a little bit. I'm not going to press it all the way up or all the way to the center. I'm going to press it in just a little bit, so when I have the seal in, there'll be a little bit of a space between the seal and the bearing. So let's go ahead, let's set it up, let's get her in there. And and I found a socket that fits real nice in there, so that way I can press that bearing in without much issue. So let's get it set up, let's get her done. That came out a lot better than I anticipated. It did get a little tight. I had to kind of force the bearing in there a little bit, but nothing major. The seal, I mean, that came out mint. I got a nice little air gap. Probably wish I had a little bit more between the bearing. Oops, there it is, the bearing and the seal, but I'm not going to force anything more into it, and I'd have to rip the seal out in order to get the bearing down deeper, but that should be sufficient enough. But that's all set. And you saw I slid it on. It spins real nice and smooth on the shaft, so that should be all good too. Next, so I'm going to put this aside, letting that blue Loctite kind of, cure. To be honest with you, I did not need it at all. That bearing went in there tight enough. That thing's never going to spin. So that's real good. I'm real happy with that. I might actually even wipe that blue Loctite out of there. Actually, I am. There's no need for it. Next up, we're going to go ahead and measure the length of the outer tube, so that way I can get that to where I want it to be. Once I get that, that'll dictate the depth I need to press that brass insert into the tube itself. So let's get the tube, let's do some measuring, let's get to some cutting. Loosely put this all together just so I can figure out what the length of the outer tube is going to be. One of the things is I need to put this, obviously need to put the steering wheel on. This is the top cap, all right, which spins with the steering wheel. That's part of the reason why there's a spring here. It keeps the cap forced up. I have plenty of movement here, so like this bushing will get pressed into the tube at about this position. Maybe, yeah, right about there. I think that's right about where we're going to go, because it doesn't need a ton of pressure on the back of the steering wheel, to be honest with you, but it does need a little bit. I want the tube to fall just about in the center of the cap, so coming up to about there. Keep in mind, I don't have the nut on the steering wheel, so the steering wheel might go down just a little bit more, and I want to make sure I have enough clearance if that does happen. So the tube goes right to the top of that weld, and if I take a look, looks like we're going to do 22 3/4. I think that's right. I think that's going to be the best initial length of my tube. So I'm going to go ahead, refine the measurement, and get the tube cut, slip it together, and let's see how bad it is. The tube is cut. Let's go ahead and see how it came out. First shot, not bad. Steering wheel, if we take a look in the keyway, we have another thread to maybe thread and a half in there inside the wheel, so I know I have enough, turning nut thread, so we're good there. Spacing, if we grab this and we slide it back, that's about the amount of spacing I have, so the cap will float as it should once we get the spring in there. And if I get the flashlight and we take a look, I don't know if I can show this on camera, but if we look up inside, let's see if I can do that. No, not really, but the tube does appear to be about right here, like right in that area, right there by my finger. So we got plenty of clearance. And if we come down to the bottom, you can see how it is butted right up against the housing itself. So that looks magnificent. Now, before I go ahead and press the bearing or the bronze bushing that I made into the top of the column, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and make like 3 slits in the bottom of this tube where the clamp goes. So I'm going to go ahead and get the clamp, make a couple marks, all right? I'm going to measure the outer circumference of the tube, drill 3 little holes, because I'm going to put 3 slits in it, and then I'll cut it either with the hacksaw or maybe with the die grinder, because the die grinder might be a little bit, cause a little bit of a thicker slot. That way when I put the clamp on, it'll clamp onto the housing without really having to crank the hell out of it. So let me get that done, because this I'm considering finished. I just took a piece of manila card, wrapped it around, cut it with the knife, so that way I knew it was just, fairly close to the circumference of the pipe. Took that, laid that card out by the ruler, took a measurement, divided it by 3. It worked out to be 1.064, because the actual circumference is 4.8125. Divided that by 3, it's about 39/64. It's just a hair shorter than that, but just to keep it simple. Went ahead, laid it back out onto the ruler here, took those measurements, that basically the 1 and 39/64. Started from the edge, made a mark, and then made a mark. You know, obviously that would be the third cut. Just took a little bit of marker, went down, made a scribe line using my square, so that way I knew it was nice and straight. And here it is. One thing I did do is I measured the distance from the weld to the top of this, as well as the thickness of the clamp. So the clamp thickness is right there. It's just a hair above the bottom of the pipe, okay? And the slots are not going to go up, above the top of the cap. The slot should come to just about right there, according to my measurements. So hopefully that'll work out. Basically what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go get a center punch and punch a little dimple right here on the lines. And then I'm going to go ahead and drill it with a drill bit. I don't know what size. I'll just get whatever size I think looks right. And then I'll cut the slots up. And then with the drill hole, that will give us a nice clean look. It won't, it won't look all tattered and stupid. But I'll cut those slots in. That'll give the pipe the ability to crush in a little bit once I go ahead and squeeze the clamp on. And this clamp isn't like pinned or, and there's no like ridge. So we should be able to get the pipe off if we needed to. It shouldn't be crimped on like with a death grip. And soon to come, you'll see why I don't want to really crimp this down so super tight, because I do want to do a non-original modification, I believe. I'll see how that goes. Something to come up, something to keep you with bated breath. I may do a modification at the top of the tube, and that has to be clocked a certain way. So I'll worry about that later. But let's go ahead, get this drilled and cut, and we'll fit it back together. There's one of the 3 slots. The other 2 slots are complete, but as you can see, clean. We're seated right up against the weld. I didn't go up too far where there's a hole or something stupid where you can see into the tube, because grease would just come out where that is. I mean, grease is going to eventually work its way out anyways, but when we take the clamp, when we slide the clamp down, let me get my flashlight here real quick. You can just barely see the bottom of the slot right there. And then obviously where I drilled the hole is right there. So that, to me, is going to be perfect. And it's visually going to look, I think it's visually going to look great. Next thing I need to do is take the measurement and set the depth. How far down I want that brass insert with the bearing to go down. Because we've got to work the spring, the cap, and a couple thrust washers and another bearing into the top of it. So let me figure that out and we'll talk about it. Okay, so now the measurements that I'm going to be providing you are the measurements for my tractor. If you've torn your senior steering column apart to fix it, this is not original. I made all these parts. So just giving insight as to what my thought process is. What I figured out is I want this brass bushing with the bearing to be 2.5 inches from the top of the shaft to the top of the bushing itself. That gives me what I believe is enough preload on the spring to hold the cap up against the back, that spring, that cap against the back of the steering wheel. That in turn means that the top of this bushing has to be right about there in my tube. I'm going to go ahead, fit this all together, remeasure everything, make sure I got everything where I want it, and it appears that it's going to work. I'll set something up on the floor here to jack my tube up, and then I'll use the press to press this into the tube, setting the depth with my dial calipers. All right, let's get to verifying measurements. I'm setting up the tube in the drill press. That's the end that goes to the steering box. And this is where that bronze bushing and bearing is that I tapped in with the hammer. And we'll talk about that in a second. And what am I going to do right here? I'm going to do something that's non-original to a senior. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a grease fitting. I'm going to drill and tap this out for a 1/4-28 grease fitting. So that way I can feed grease into that Torrington bearing that's inside the tube. I'll clock this tube in such a way that the grease fitting is pointing down on the tractor, so you won't even really see it, but it will be there so I could pump grease into that Torrington bearing and also the thrust bearing that I'm using for the spring up on top. So let's go ahead, let's get it set up, drill it, tap it, and then we'll take a look at the finished product with the pressed in bushing. And there we are. Now I did try to press that bronze bushing or brass bushing into the pipe with the press, but because I was pushing on the floor, it kept lifting the table up off the ground. But in actuality, I didn't really have to hit it hard with the hammer. Obviously, I had to give it some good whacks, got it all the way down in there, okay? There's the bearing and the seal is in all the way down there. I had to install those first before I press this in, especially the seal, because the seal came in from the bottom. And then we got the grease fitting, which I think was absolutely, you know, it might be just, where the hell am I? There we are. It's a clean install. Oh yeah, that's good. So that's all in there. We got the little port for the grease to go in. There's a thrust bearing and a that goes on the top that lets the spring turn. The end of the tube. I think that came out pretty darn nice. I have test fitted it and it's perfect, man. I can't believe how nice it spins and how solid it feels. So this thing's all set. The only thing I need to do is take this over to my buddy's place. We're going to use his welder because it's a little bit more, it's a better welder. So I'm going to break this all apart, head over there, weld up my shaft. So that's all done. And in the next video, what we'll do is we'll put this whole thing all back together. We'll put the bushings in the box, we'll put the arm in, we'll put the side cover on, we'll put the tube together, show you all the bearings, put the clamp in place. You know, the only thing I won't put on is the steering wheel because I need to keep the steering wheel off in order to get the hood on the tractor. But essentially, we'll get this whole thing back together. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. I know this was a long one, but there was a lot of thinking and measuring that needed to be done in order to get it back together. I think what you see in the next video, you're going to be pleasantly surprised. All right. As always, thank you very much for your viewership, and you have a great day.